Long before empires drew lines on maps, before leaders spoke of legacy and power, there was the desert. It has no voice, yet it remembers everything. Every promise made in desperation. Every betrayal buried beneath shifting sand. Every life spent chasing control in a world that refuses to be owned. The desert does not forget, and it does not forgive. It simply waits. When the wind rises across the eastern dunes, the elders say the desert is listening. Not to prayers, but to intent. To what men truly want when no one is watching. Storms do not come at random. They arrive when something has gone out of balance, when ambition grows heavier than wisdom, when strength is mistaken for purpose. On one such night, as the sky burned with the color of old bronze and lightning carved scars across the horizon, a lone figure emerged from the storm. Not a conqueror. Not a savior. A reminder. Armor worn thin by time and consequence. A cloak unraveling into dust. Wherever he rode, the sand rose as if recognizing an old debt. They once knew him as a man. Now they speak of him as a warning. He is called the Sandstorm Knight, not because he commands the storm, but because he survived what others could not. Because he learned, too late, that power answers differently than we expect. And because the desert, which remembers every choice ever made upon it, decided his story was not finished. This is not a tale about victory. It is a story about restraint, about responsibility, about what remains after the storm passes, and who must stand guard when the world moves on. The first true sandstorm did not arrive like a threat. It came quietly, almost politely, as if giving Cale Arden time to reconsider every choice that had brought him into the open desert that day. The horizon dimmed, the air thickened, and the wind shifted with an unfamiliar weight. Veterans of the dunes knew that sound well. The low, distant roar that meant the desert was about to remind men how small they were. Cale and his patrol were miles from the walls of Khazir when the storm revealed its full intention. What began as wind became violence. Sand struck exposed skin like broken glass. Visibility collapsed into nothingness. Shouted orders vanished the moment they left a mouth, swallowed by a sound so vast it erased direction itself. Men who had survived raids and sieges panicked, not from fear of death, but from the certainty of being lost. One by one, Cale lost them. A silhouette swallowed by the dust. A scream cut short. A body that simply disappeared, as if the desert had reached out and claimed what it was owed. Training offered no answers here. Discipline meant nothing. There was only instinct, and the stubborn refusal to lie down and wait for the sand to finish its work. Guided by something he could not name, Cale pushed deeper into the storm instead of fleeing from it. That decision, irrational, reckless, would define everything that followed. At the heart of the storm, where reason said nothing should stand, he found silence. An obsidian monolith rose from the sand, dark and smooth, untouched by the wind that raged everywhere else. It did not tower or impress. It simply existed, ancient and certain, as if the storm itself had formed around it rather than the other way around. Faint symbols traced its surface, glowing like embers buried beneath ash. They were not a language meant to be read. They were meant to be recognized. As Cale approached, the storm began to change. The wind softened, not retreating, but listening. The sand no longer cut. It circled, slow and deliberate, as though the desert were holding its breath. He reached out. The moment his hand touched the stone, the world broke open. Pain flooded him, not the sharp pain of wounds, but the deep, overwhelming weight of knowledge forced into a human mind not built to carry it. He saw cities erased without fire, armies buried without graves, empires reduced to memory, then to myth, then to nothing at all. He saw knights like himself, armored figures riding storms across centuries, faceless not because they were forgotten, but because they no longer belonged to themselves. He saw his own reflection among them. The desert did not speak in words. It answered in truth. Power, it showed him, was not a gift. It was a responsibility imposed without consent. Those who survived the storm did not master it. They became bound to it, shaped by it, consumed by it over time. When the wind finally fell silent, Cale collapsed into the sand, alone. He returned to Khazir days later, changed in ways he did not yet understand. The sun no longer drained him. The heat felt distant, manageable. When he walked, the sand shifted as if making room. And when danger came, when steel rang and men shouted, the wind responded to him, bending toward his presence like iron filings toward a magnet. At first, he told himself this was a blessing, a tool, something that could be controlled. But control is a story men tell themselves when they are afraid to admit the truth. The people of Khazir noticed the change before he did. They watched the way the wind moved around him, the way his shadow seemed longer at dusk, the way battles ended too quickly, too completely. Awe turned into caution, caution into fear, and fear, once planted, grows faster than anything in the desert. Kale felt it too, the subtle pull beneath his thoughts, the quiet suggestion to use more, push further, finish threats before they fully formed. The desert did not demand obedience. It offered efficiency, certainty, finality. That was the beginning of the tragedy. Because the moment a man believes power is listening to him, he stops listening to everyone else. And when Kale Arden first felt the desert answer his will, he did not yet realize that every answer carries a cost, and that one day, the desert would collect. The first true sandstorm did not announce itself with drama. There was no sudden wall of darkness, no immediate panic. Instead, the desert grew quiet in a way that unsettled even the most experienced men. The horizon blurred, the air thickened, and the wind shifted direction with a deliberate patience, like something deciding whether to strike. Kale Arden felt it before he saw it. A pressure in the chest, a tightening behind the eyes. The kind of warning that comes too late to change course. By the time the storm revealed its full force, retreat was no longer an option. Sand tore through the air, driven with the precision of 1,000 unseen blades. The sky vanished. Distance became meaningless. Orders dissolved the moment they were spoken. Men who had trained their entire lives to face violence discovered that chaos does not respect courage. The desert stripped them of certainty first, then of direction, then of each other. Kale lost sight of his patrol one by one, not through dramatic deaths, but through absence. A figure swallowed by dust. Footsteps that simply ended. The storm did not rage, it erased. And in that erasure, Kale understood something instinctively. Survival would not come from resisting the storm, but from moving through it. He walked when reason said to stop. He pressed forward when fear demanded he kneel. Something deeper than training guided him, pulling him toward a point where the noise of the world seemed to bend inward. At the center of the storm, there was silence. Rising from the sand stood an obsidian monolith, smooth and unyielding, untouched by the violence surrounding it. It was not imposing by size, nor impressive in design. Its presence carried weight, not authority. Time clung to it, heavy and unresolved. Symbols faintly glimmered along its surface, not carved for men to decipher, but etched as reminders of something far older than memory. As Kale approached, the storm slowed. The wind circled instead of striking. The sand no longer cut, it waited. He reached out without understanding why. The moment his hand met the stone, the desert answered. There were no words, no voices, only an overwhelming flood of awareness. Kale saw civilizations rise with confidence and fall without warning. He saw leaders mistake control for wisdom. He saw strength outpace restraint and leave ruin in its wake. Cities vanished not in fire, but beneath patience, the long, quiet patience of time and sand. He saw figures like himself, armored shapes moving through storms across centuries. Not heroes, not villains, custodians of imbalance. Men who survived encounters they were never meant to survive, and paid for it by becoming something less than human and more than mortal. And among them he saw his own future, featureless, enduring, bound. When the vision released him, Kale collapsed into the sand, the storm already loosening its grip. The wind withdrew as if its task was complete. The desert had made a choice. He returned to Khazir changed, though no wound marked his body. The sun no longer exhausted him. Heat became tolerable, almost distant. When he walked, the sand shifted subtly beneath his feet, responding rather than resisting. In moments of danger, The wind moved before he did, bending toward his presence with quiet obedience. At first, Kale told himself this was protection. A tool meant to serve the city. A means to ensure survival in a world that offered none. But power rarely reveals its cost all at once. The people noticed the difference before Kale did. They watched the way battles ended faster than necessary. How threats were buried instead of resolved. How the wind seemed to favor him, isolating him from those he stood beside. Admiration gave way to unease. Unease settled into fear. And fear, once rooted, reshapes communities as surely as any storm. Within Kale, something shifted as well. A presence that did not command him, but suggested. Efficiency over mercy. Certainty over patience. Finality over doubt. The desert did not demand obedience, it offered solutions. That was the most dangerous part. Because the moment a man believes power exists to answer him, he stops questioning whether he should ask at all. Kale had touched something ancient and impartial, and it had responded, not with judgment, but with permission. The tragedy was not that the desert answered. It was that Kale believed he could decide when to stop listening. Power rarely announces when it begins to take more than it gives. At first, it feels like relief. Problems end faster. Threats lose their weight. The chaos that once demanded long nights and difficult choices seems, suddenly, manageable. For Kale Arden, this was the most dangerous phase, not the storm itself, but the sense that the storm was finally useful. The desert answered him more often now. Not dramatically, not with spectacle, but with efficiency. When raiders approached the city, the wind shifted before scouts returned. When steel was drawn, sand rose to blind and disorient before the first blow landed. Battles shortened. Casualties decreased. On the surface, Khazir appeared safer than it had ever been. But safety built on fear is never stable. Kale began to notice the changes in himself through absence rather than presence. He no longer felt hesitation before violence. Decisions that once required counsel now arrived fully formed, unquestioned. The wind responded so quickly that it erased the space where doubt used to live. And without doubt, restraint has nowhere to take root. The elders spoke to him carefully at first, choosing words as one might around a fire that had grown unpredictable. They thanked him. They praised his loyalty. Then quietly they asked him to be cautious. Kale heard the concern, but not the warning. To him, the desert was a force of nature, and nature could not be immoral. It simply was. What he failed to understand was that power does not need intent to cause harm. It only needs permission. The people felt it long before they could articulate it. When Kale passed through the streets, conversations dimmed. Children were pulled closer. Eyes followed the movement of his cloak, the subtle way the sand seemed to shift around his boots. Gratitude remained, but it was now paired with something colder. Uncertainty. Distance. Fear does not always look like resistance. Sometimes it looks like obedience. In battle, the line between protection and annihilation blurred. When Kale called the wind, it did not distinguish between threat and proximity. It moved with purpose, not compassion. Enemies fell buried and broken, but so did allies caught too close. Structures collapsed. Lives ended without names or final words. The desert did not adjust for human error. Afterward, Kale convinced himself that outcomes mattered more than cost. That survival demanded difficult choices. That leadership meant carrying guilt so others would not have to. These were the stories leaders often tell themselves when the weight becomes unbearable. And like most comforting narratives, they were not lies, but they were incomplete. At night, when Khazir finally slept, Kale stood beyond the city walls and listened to the wind. It no longer felt like something outside him. It moved through him as easily as it moved across the dunes, responding not just to command, but to emotion. Anger sharpened it. Fear intensified it. And in moments of exhaustion, it stirred on its own, restless, impatient, alert. That was when he understood the shift had already happened. The desert was no longer something he summoned. It was something that anticipated him. The elders' warnings grew firmer, less ceremonial. So did the distance between Kale and the people he had sworn to protect. Where he once stood among them, he now stood apart. Where he had once been a man carrying a sword, he had become a presence that altered the air itself. The realization came gradually, then all at once. Kale no longer needed to raise his voice for the storm to respond. Sometimes, he did not even need to decide. The desert answered intent, not instruction. And intent, he learned, is shaped by habit. Power, once woven into daily life, stops feeling like power. It becomes expectation. And expectation removes the final barrier between action and consequence. There were moments, quiet, fleeting, when Kale caught his reflection in polished metal or still water and barely recognized the figures staring back. His eyes carried a distance he could not remember earning. His posture held weight that had nothing to do with armor. He looked less like a guardian and more like a boundary. No longer fully human. Not yet something else. The tragedy was never that Kale used the power he had been given. It was that each time he relied on it, the space for choice narrowed. The desert did not punish him for his decisions. It adapted to them, shaping itself around his will until his will could no longer be separated from its own. By the time Kale understood what he was becoming, the city no longer saw a knight standing between them and destruction. They saw the storm itself, and wondered how long it would wait before turning. The siege of Khazir began at dawn, the way most irreversible things do, without ceremony, without hesitation. The Western Empire's banners appeared first on the horizon, dark shapes cutting through pale morning light. Then came the sound, the measured rhythm of an army that believed time was on its side. Khazir had survived sieges before. Its walls were strong, its people disciplined. But this time, hope did not rise from the battlements. It rose from one man. Kale Arden stood atop the walls as siege engines rolled forward. He felt the storm coil within him long before the first stone struck. The desert recognized the pattern instantly: conquest, resistance, collapse. It had seen it all before. The elders pleaded for restraint. They asked him to protect the city, not erase it. Kale listened. But the storm listened louder. When the gates finally broke, the decision no longer felt like a choice. Kale stepped forward and released what he had been holding back. The desert rose. Sand surged into towering spirals, blotting out the sky. Wind erased distinction between soldier and civilian, weapon and shelter. Men vanished where they stood. Siege towers folded like paper. Command dissolved into chaos. Kale moved at the center, no longer directing, no longer reacting. The storm flowed through him with terrifying efficiency. He did not see faces. He did not hear voices. He was not defending Khazir. He was enforcing an ending. When the wind finally settled, silence followed, not peace, but absence. Khazir was gone. Not conquered. Not captured. Buried. The enemy army had vanished. So had the streets of Kale's childhood. The markets. The towers. Citizens lay beneath the sand beside invaders, indistinguishable in death. There were no cheers. Only the realization that survival had demanded a price no one had agreed to pay. Kale had won. And in winning, he had destroyed the very thing he meant to protect. Judgment came quietly. No accusations. No rage. Only truth. The elders stripped Kale of his name, his sword, his place. Not as punishment, but as necessity. Power without restraint could not remain at the center of a living world. Exile followed. And from that exile, legend grew. The Sandstorm Knight became a story carried by caravans. A warning. A reminder. A figure who did not rule the desert, but endured within it. Redemption came not through victory, but restraint. Not through dominance, but patience. Through learning when not to act. And when the world once again mistook control for wisdom, Kale made his final choice, not to command the storm, but to become part of it. This is not a story about conquest. It is a story about leadership, responsibility, and restraint. For anyone who has built something, led others, or carried power longer than anyone noticed, this story speaks quietly but clearly. Real strength is not proven by control, but by knowing when to step back. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment sharing what the desert remembers in your own life. And stay with us, Because the most important stories are not about winning storms, but about enduring after they pass.